Chapter 20 is titled Prescription of Exercise for Health and Fitness. And that's a little bit unique to this book because thus far we've really been talking about exercise for athletes or for sport performance, but exercise is critical for the health and wellness of the population. Used to be back in the day they would use this product called borax. And they would use borax for colds and illnesses, and turns out it was poison. They continued to this day to use it in products like Ajax and floor cleaners and stuff like that. But they used to use it for health and fitness as a prescription for health and fitness. But maybe instead of using poisonous chemicals, maybe we can start using exercise. And in fact, we can. My mom is a pharmacist, and I ask her, as an exercise and health scientist, does my career in exercise, using exercise as a prescription, butt heads with her career as a pharmacist? And she says, no, as a pharmacist, that they're taught that changing lifestyle and things that you do in your daily life is the first step, and if those things don't help, then maybe pharmacotherapy is a chance for improvement. But we always want to try to go back to exercise and lifestyle choices as our first opportunity to combat illness. Slide 2 goes through an overview of the chapter. The chapter talks about various health benefits of exercise, including the cardiovascular disease risk factors. Individuals with a number of the risk factors may or may not need medical clearance. They'll be in high, low, or medium risk. And then the chapter discusses how to actually use exercise as a prescription, varying intensity, frequency, duration, type of exercise in order to achieve various health-related goals. The benefits of exercise are well researched. In 1992, research showed that inactivity is a major risk for coronary artery disease, and the research continues. It could be the case if you look at Caldwell-Esselstyn's work. Caldwell-Esselstyn, Esselstyn. He's got a number of TED Talks and a number of other documentaries, but it could be the case that with exercise and proper nutrition, we could eliminate cardiovascular disease, and not just reduce it, but potentially eliminate all cases of it. Exercise is a profound combatant of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, various types of cancers. So potentially we should understand how to use exercise not only as an opportunity to get strong, more powerful, and to do better in sport, but to actually keep our bodies more healthy. In the United States, less than 50% of the population does daily physical activity, according to census reports and self-report analyses, which have their inherent flaws, but 60 to 68% of the country is either overweight or obese, and it doesn't seem as though individuals are doing enough exercise. It seems as though, although we have a lot of knowledge, we don't really apply the knowledge that we do have. In fact, to be quite honest with you, I don't really exercise all that much. I have a very active job. I'm a gymnastics coach. I go to the gym 9 hours a day, and I also, teach at school. But aside from that, I don't really do too much lifting or external exercise either. So I mean, I feel like a big hypocrite, but in the United States, the trend is to know that exercise is good for you, but for some reason, either it's the chase of the dollar or time or whatever it is. Maybe you just don't have access to workout equipment, things like that. But it doesn't really need to be, go to the gym for an hour and a half and work out at the highest intensity. You could just do 30 minutes of walking. You could do 15 minutes of running a day. The benefits increase as the number of workouts increase, and the time spent exercising increases. It seems like a no-brainer, but we still have a little bit of an issue with compliance. Slide 5 is a video. You guys will be able to take a look at that. Before people should do exercise, they should make sure that they're safe to do exercise. In lab, oftentimes you'll be given a PAR-Q, a physical activity readiness questionnaire. You may have to do medical history questionnaire, lifestyle evaluations. Individuals who are at high risk, according to the the number of cardiovascular disease risk factors that they present with, should exercise under medical supervision. They should also get a stress test or a maximum effort exercise test prior to doing exercise. They need to make sure that if they are at high risk, there's medical supervision, and then they get medical clearance to do any of the things that they're doing. So you can't have somebody come into, workout world and go directly to the treadmill. They should come in, they should do the necessary paperwork, and you should make sure that you do a risk evaluation. And high risk individuals need to seek clearance by a medical provider prior to doing anything. That medical evaluation should include blood pressure, heart rate, but could also include percent body fat, lipid values. You need to make sure that you have an understanding of their total cholesterol values, their blood pressure. These are all different cardiovascular risk factors. We'll get to those in a bit. In fact, I may as well go to slide 9 first, table 20.1, because that's the list of cardiovascular disease risk factors, and potentially the suggestions regarding exercise to combat each one of those risk factors. Some of the risk factors on table 20.1 are modifiable, things that you could do something about, and some of them you can't really do anything about. Even if you are the most healthy individual in the world, you can't do anything about your age. Age, if males are older than 45 and if females are older than 55, then age becomes a cardiovascular disease risk factor. It's actually coronary artery disease risk factor. So right now, I just turned 42 about a week ago. So although age is not a risk factor thus far for me, in 3 years, I'm going to have a coronary artery disease risk factor, the positive risk factor, and there's nothing I can do about it. It just has to do with my age. And so, I don't feel necessarily that I am at risk for cardiovascular disease or coronary artery disease right now. I feel like I'm healthy. I feel like I'm young. But when I take a look at these coronary artery disease risk factors, unfortunately, I'm at high risk. So I need to make sure that I do the necessary steps prior to exercise, or at least that I'm aware. Or you can't judge a book by its cover. Just because I am an exercise physiology professor at Sc.D University doesn't mean that I'm not at high risk for coronary artery disease. It doesn't mean that I eat great. It doesn't mean that I exercise the same amount that I should. So I think that, and just because an individual seems to be overweight or obese doesn't mean that they are not healthy. So our definition of obesity and health and the way that we treat each other probably should also be cognizant of the fact that just the outside appearance doesn't necessarily give the guarantee of physical wellness. So age is a risk factor. Family history. If anybody in your family has had, here, let me just go through the details. If anybody in your family has had a heart attack or a bypass, or has died before the age of 55 years, or before the age of 65 years, in terms of like female first degree relatives, that's a risk factor. So my dad died at 64 and a half years old, and he had pretty much all of that stuff. So again, my family history is something that's not modifiable. I can't do anything about the fact that my dad was an ill man. But because of my family history, I have a certain coronary artery disease risk factor there. In regards to cigarette smoking, I do not smoke cigarettes, but cigarettes are not the only thing that are being smoked these days. There's vape pens now. Marijuana is legal almost in many different states. I think 6 now. People are still smoking cigarettes, so it's not just cigarette smoking that is potentially dangerous, although the research suggests that, or the research that they have is focused on cigarette smoking. An interesting thing is, though, if you've quit for longer than 6 months, it's no longer a positive risk factor. So, if you do currently smoke cigarettes, or if you are trying to quit, the carrot at the end of the stick is that it ceases to become a positive risk factor if you've quit for longer than 6 months. Should also go over the term what risk factor is. A risk factor is something that could improve or increase or decrease the potential for um, obtaining a state of disease or morbidity or mortality or something like that. So a risk factor that's positive, a positive risk factor, is something you don't want. It increases the risk. A negative risk factor is a good thing. It's something that I'll explain what a negative risk factor is in a bit, because there's one associated with the concentration of high density lipoprotein, but we'll get to it in a bit. So right now, I do not have age as a risk factor, but I certainly do have family history, and I do not have cigarette smoking. Hypertension. If your systolic blood pressure exceeds 140 millimeters of mercury, or your diastolic blood pressure exceeds 90 millimeters of mercury, that is borderline hypertension, pre-hypertension. Actually, that's hypertension. Yeah. Back in the day when I was drinking, I would do the labs, and my students would tell me that I'd have a blood pressure of like 180 over uh, um, 95 or something. And I realized that I had, because of the labs that I teach, I realized that I had high blood pressure. So I quit drinking, and I also started exercising a bit more than I used to. I play racquetball and walk golf courses and try to run during the summer and stuff. And I got my blood pressure back to healthy values. So with a little bit of exercise and a little bit of knowledge, I was able to reduce my hypertension so that it's no longer a positive risk factor for me. Dyslipidemia is dys is something not good. Lipid is fat, and emia is blood, so not good fat in the blood. So it's when your cholesterol values are not efficient or not correct. In terms of total cholesterol, you should have less than 200 milligrams per deciliter of blood. It becomes a positive risk factor if you exceed 200 milligrams per deciliter of blood. In terms of total cholesterol. But total cholesterol is a combination of low density lipoprotein and high density lipoprotein. Low density lipoprotein is so small, it's such small molecules that they can fit under the endothelial cell walls, and then they start to kind of build up the area underneath the cell wall into this like scab kind of thing, and then the endothelial cells start to make like a plaque over that particular area, and then to protect the cells, and that's pretty much the beginning of arteriosclerotic plaque. And so low density lipoprotein you don't want. Low density lipoprotein are small enough to fit under the endothelial walls. High density lipoprotein, though, those molecules are big enough so that they can actually dislodge the low density lipoproteins as they're kind of rushing in the bloodstream by. So the high density lipoproteins are actually cholesterols that we do want, and low density lipoproteins are cholesterols that we don't want. We want to keep our low density lipoprotein values below 130 milligrams per deciliter. And we want to keep our high density lipoproteins greater than 40 milligrams per deciliter. And in fact, if you can get enough high density lipoproteins or higher than 60 milligrams per deciliter, it becomes a negative risk factor. So you would add up all the risk factors that you have. Eventually, I'm going to have probably, let's go with three of them: age, family history, and sedentary lifestyle. All right, that would mean that if I do have an HDL value of higher than 60, instead of three risk factors, a negative risk factor would subtract a risk factor, and then I'd only have two risk factors. So you want to have low density lipoprotein and high density lipoprotein. Prediabetes is when you have a fasting blood glucose of greater than 100 milligrams per deciliter. But less than 126 milligrams per deciliter. If you're fasting, you really shouldn't have too much carbohydrate, protein, or fat in your blood compared to if you're eating anyhow. So when you're fasting, if your blood glucose values are still too high, that means that your insulin response isn't efficient enough, and maybe the amount of activity that you're doing isn't enough, and the amount of fat-free mass that you have maybe isn't enough to be able to process all of that blood glucose. So when it starts to pool in your bloodstream, that is an indicator that you have poor insulin sensitivity, or an inability to shuttle all of the blood glucose somewhere. So that is the indicator that you're potentially pre-diabetic. Obesity is defined as a body mass index of greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared, or for males, a waist girth of greater than 102 centimeters, and for females, greater than 88 centimeters. Just be careful that using the body mass index as your sole indicator of obesity is a little bit suspect, because body mass index doesn't take into account whether or not the kilograms that you're measuring is a greater percentage of fat-free mass or a greater percentage of fat mass. So an individual who weighs 200 pounds, if they're 50% body fat or if they're 75% body fat, is going to have the same body mass index. So it could be the case that although we do include body mass index as a convenient way of categorizing individuals into weight categories, potentially we want to cross-reference that with hydrostatic weighing or bioelectrical impedance or some other way of determining body composition. The last coronary artery disease risk factor is sedentary lifestyle, and I don't believe that I conduct, especially during the winter. During the summer, I probably walk a huge amount in terms of like golf, but during the winter, I do not get at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity, which is 40 to 60% of VO2 max, on at least 3 days of the week for at least 3 months in a row. So, unfortunately, I wish I exercised more. And every day I think about it, and every day is another day for me to act. So, in regards to the intensity of exercise, that should be moderate intensity. That could also be evaluated or assessed in METs, metabolic equivalence, which is a comparison of the amount of oxygen that you're breathing at at this time compared to the amount of oxygen that you would be breathing at rest. Average individual is going to breathe 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. An individual who weighs more, therefore, is going to be breathing a greater volume of oxygen, a greater absolute volume of oxygen. When an individual is resting, they're typically breathing 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Therefore, if you are resting at this moment and you're breathing 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and you compare that with what you do during rest, which is also 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute, that's a 3.5 divided by 3.5, or a ratio of 1. Therefore, rest is a metabolic equivalent of 1. Now, if I start to do activity and my activity ends, my activity requires that I spend 7 milliliters per kilogram per minute, I spend or breathe twice as much oxygen. 7 milliliters per kilogram per minute divided by 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute would be 2 METs. So if I'm doing an activity right now that requires me to breathe twice the amount of oxygen than I would during rest, that would be a metabolic equivalent of 2. 0 to 3 METs is light activity. 3 to 6 METs is moderate intensity activity. And 9 or higher is more intense physical activity. Now we're going to switch back to slide 8, because slide 8 will give us an understanding of whether or not a low risk, moderate risk, or higher risk individual will need medical clearance. Low risk is an individual that has no signs, symptoms of medical or cardiopulmonary, cardiovascular disease, and they have less than 2 coronary artery disease risk factors. Moderate risk individual has 2 or more risk factors, but no signs or symptoms of metabolic disease, pulmonary cardiovascular disease. And a high risk individual has signs and symptoms of disease. So if we, for instance, go to slide 11, it will give us a little flow chart of how to gather information and use that information to eventually put an individual in one of those risk categories. So number one at the top, going to review health or medical history, your PAR-Q, your medical history questionnaire, your lifestyle evaluation questionnaire, and you're going to go through your coronary artery disease risk factors. You're going to gather that information. Then, given that information, do they have any known cardiovascular, pulmonary, or metabolic disease? And then there's a list of those things to the right. What are those known disease? Cardiovascular, cardiac peripheral vascular, or cardiovascular disease, pulmonary, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, emphysema, cystic fibrosis, or do they have metabolic disease like type 1, type 2 diabetes, or anything like that? If they have any of those known metabolic, pulmonary, or cardiovascular disease, then they would be immediately shuttled down to high risk. And if they have high risk, then before they do any physical activity, they need to get medical clearance. They also need to do a stress test, a maximum stress test with a medical care provider, and they also need to be present. A medical care provider needs to be present if they're doing any stress tests or any other high-risk exercises. If they do not have any known pulmonary, cardiovascular, metabolic disease, then do they have any signs or symptoms of any of those metabolic diseases or other issues, such as pain or discomfort in the chest, shortness of breath, dizziness, syncope, edema or palpitations, tachycardia, or anything like that? Then if they do have signs or symptoms of that, boom, high risk again. If they do not have any major signs or symptoms, then count the number of coronary artery disease risk factors. If they have less than 2 risk factors, they would be at low risk. If they have 2 or more risk factors, they would be at moderate risk. Now, that matters because an individual who is at high risk should have medical clearance and needs to be cleared by a health and fitness professional before any of the exercise program can be begun. How would you gain medical clearance? Well, you'd go to your doctor and you'd do a graded exercise test or some type of submax or maximum heart rate exercise test. A graded exercise test is a test that starts at low intensity and eventually gets to higher and higher intensities, challenging the cardiovascular response and the pulmonary response of the subject. A typical graded exercise test would be the Bruce treadmill protocol. It could be conducted on a bike as well. There could be oxygen capturing masks, which is going to be a direct measurement of VO2 max and other key variables, or it could be a more indirect test where what you're doing is just using the length on the treadmill as your main variable and plugging that into estimating calculations that will give you an assessment of VO2 max and other things. It could be the case that doing an ECG is necessary, but we're not going to cover that in this class too much. Graded exercise testing is good to predict potential problems that an individual will have when they're doing other bouts of exercise. You may say, well, does a high-risk individual who is doing an exercise test, doesn't that, if they're doing a maximum exercise test in they're a high-risk individual, isn't that dangerous? Well, I mean, it potentially could be dangerous, but that's why you need to make sure that you have medical clearance and that you have a supervision by your primary care provider so that if anything does go wrong, you can terminate the procedure accordingly. Okay, right now we are on slide 19. We start talking about exercise prescription. And just like any medication, if you're going to give exercise as a medication or a prescription or a drug or whatever, just a medication, you would say you have to take 2 of these three times a day, take it with milk. You have 12 of them and you get a refill next week. There are certain factors that you need to include with any exercise prescription as well, such as the mode, the type, the frequency, the duration. How long do you want somebody to exercise? What do you want them to do? Are there going to be different activities each day? Are they going to be doing exercise prior to eating food, or do they need to make sure that they do nutrient timing and nutrient intake before, after exercise? Are they going to be doing carb loading or anything like that? So you just need to make sure that you're able to address each of those particular variables in regards to an appropriate exercise prescription. Just like the overload principle, there's a minimum threshold of exercise that is going to be beneficial for people's health. And that's going to be different potentially for each of the health concerns that you have and that you're using exercise to potentially address. For an individual with cardiovascular disease, they're going to need to work out potentially at a more moderate to intense exercise intensity. An individual who has diabetes, who wants to address their glucose concentration issues, maybe what they should do is just any walking at all is good, because any activity is going to burn at least some of the blood glucose. So depending upon what health related state or event you're trying to address, it could be the case that the intensity of the exercise changes. But again, there is a minimum threshold by which any lower intensity really won't allow for any improvements to occur. According to the American College of Sports Medicine, that's 30 minutes, three times a week of at least moderate exercise. Walking, cycling, rowing, swimming, racket sports, spinning, aerobics, water aerobics. These are all different types of modes that people will implement. The most important thing is that you implement something that's going to be fun for you, that you're going to want to do, that you're going to adhere to. That I mean, I don't really have a swimming pool. I do have, I guess, a lake outside that I can't swim in because it's actually, I think, a reservoir. So if I pick swimming, most likely I'm not going to be able to participate in that because I don't have anything to swim in. So you got to make sure that you pick an exercise mode that you have access to, that that enjoy doing. That if I don't have too much time in the day, then doing long distance cycling of 2 or 3 hours a day is probably going to be less time sensitive than doing something like high intensity interval training. So got to make sure that you're just picking the modes that people are going to want to do. It could be the case that different modes are going to be more specific to different competitive sports. So there's going to be some modes that are going to improve aerobic fitness, and some are going to improve